introduce Jeremy Shakun, who actually wrote the paper, and he kindly agreed to take time out of his very busy week to come talk about his paper. So just a bit of background. Jeremy and I did our PhDs together at Oregon State University. And then from there, Jeremy went on to do a postdoc in multiple locations. One of them, I think he ended up finally ending in at Harvard / Woods Hole, and now is an associate professor at Boston College University, where Andy did his undergraduate with Jeremy. So now you know the full connection here. So I thought it'd be good, Jeremy, if you just maybe give like sort of a nuts and bolts overview of the paper, and then we'll just sort of jump into the questions and follow up from last Thursday, even though you weren't here.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, hey, everybody. It's good to be here. Sean's being generous, facetious to say my busy schedule. I'm actually on sabbatical all year. So these 10 minutes are the sum total of all the teaching I'm going to do. Either going to be awful and really rusty, or I'm going to kill it because this is like the concentrated all I've got to perform for the year. Let's see. So just a quick 2-3 minute background on the paper that we wrote, where it came from. What got things started was for, 20 years, there was this amazing record from ice cores in Antarctica that showed temperature rising and falling over the ice ages and CO2 levels rising and falling over the ice ages. And when you look at the two together, they basically move in lockstep. Temperature rises, CO2 rises, it all goes together. So that all fits pretty well, right, with the sort of standard view we have of the climate system, where CO2 is maybe the big prime time mover and shaker. The interesting thing that people had noticed for a long time, but never dug into that deeply, is if you zoom in really close to any particular climate jump, the temperature jumps up first in Antarctica, and then the CO2 changes a few hundred years later. And that was always kind of an interesting curveball. And a lot of people who are skeptical of climate change picked up on that to say, oh man, we've got this completely backwards. CO2 doesn't cause climate change. CO2 is a result of climate change. That was the case in the past, and maybe that's even the case today. Maybe the CO2 rising now is an effect of climate, not a cause. So what got us thinking about it 10 years ago was that this temperature record from ice cores in Antarctica is just that. It's a temperature record from Antarctica and nothing more. And if you're going to want to get a sense of what's going on with global climate today or in the past, you're never going to go get one thermometer from one dot in a huge world, right? You got to go and see what temperature's doing here, what's doing there. Obviously, heat can blow around as the winds change, as the ocean currents change, and any one place can do all kinds of different things. So we wanted to pull together as many different paleoclimate temperature records all over the world, spanning the end of the last ice age, to really pin down what patterns we're doing and how the timing worked out between temperature and CO2 when we looked at a global perspective. So that's my kind of quick context. So if you want to jump into questions from there.
Great. Yeah, I think what we should do is let's just talk through the 3 questions. So I'm going to have people from the class, give it a shot, read out your answers, and then we'll just have some dialogue, and Jeremy can respond, give us all the secret fun stories behind everything. Okay. So question 1. So this one we basically did together in class, but I just thought it'd be a nice place to start our review. Does anybody want to share, just take the mic and talk about what the answers are here? And feel free to throw anything else into the chat, either answers or questions.
While you're thinking about it, I'll tell you right up front, and this is the way science often goes. When I started this project, I didn't know what it was we were ultimately studying. Like, this question we ultimately figured out wasn't even exactly the question I had in mind when we first started doing this. We started to get all this data together to look at patterns, and it was only later that we're like, oh, I think it answers this question we weren't even thinking about in the first place. Which is often how it goes when we do research.
Mm-hmm. Luckily, there's 2 questions. So you get Campbell takes A, Shannon gets B.
All right. So basically around 18,000 to 17,000 years ago, we see this abrupt warming that comes first, followed by the rise in CO2.
Great. Shannon?
Yeah, I wasn't a part of the big breakout group. I talked with my term paper group about this. And luckily, there's somebody in that group, Nora, who actually studies paleoclimate for her PhD. So we were talking about how, in our anthropogenic times, we think that CO2 precedes warming, but we need this forcing in order to start the release of CO2. And if there's no burning of fossil fuels, there's no, or if there isn't some like huge rush in CO2, it can't be the other way around, that CO2 precedes warming. So the forcing is this small increase in Antarctic temperatures. I think it was 0.3 degrees Celsius, which is releasing CO2 from the deep ocean.
Yeah, that's great. So just to comment, just to hit that point, like that's so on the mark. It took me the longest time to get that, but right when you think about it, it's like, why would CO2 just change all on its own, right? The climate's just sitting there stable. Why would it just start burping up into the atmosphere? Like it wouldn't, right? It makes sense. You would need the climate to start changing to push the carbon. So yeah, really good insight.
Cool. Okay, so next question 2A. So as Jeremy mentioned, right, maybe our record from Antarctica is just one thermometer and you might need more thermometers. Does this graph help anybody sort of think about that question? What are the advantages of using a global record versus a single temperature record?
I can take this one. I guess talked about it a little bit. Just putting a thermometer in one location isn't going to tell you the whole story. And you can see that really clearly from this figure of like climate changes are really varied across different places. So yeah.
Okay, cool. Does that sound good, Jeremy?
Yeah, that sounds good. And just to give you like a way to think about that, that kind of makes sense because like, I said it before, but if you change which way the wind is blowing, you're not necessarily changing how much heat there is in the planet. That stays the same. Global temperature stays the same. But like if you blow the heat from here to there, it gets colder here and hotter there. It's like you didn't change global temperature, but you made these two places do completely different crazy things. So hence you want to see the whole big picture if you're trying to assess how much heat there is overall.
Okay, and then question 3. So tying the whole thing together. So this graph, as you all saw, has the global temperature average thrown onto it. So now we have 3 curves here on the black line with the gray shading being the global temperature. So, okay, does someone want to take 3A here, right? So just what's the order of things?
I can go for it.
Please.
So what we're kind of seeing is still with like the Antarctic temperatures going first, followed by kind of a lag with the CO2 concentration levels. And then we sort of see more of a gradual lagged response by the global temperatures. And then that's the same like increases, and then as well as the dip, we kind of see a little bit closer towards the present.
Cool. I agree. Yeah, nice agreement there. Okay, so 2B. Does that make sense to you? And this is to anyone, but yeah, does it make sense that CO2 would lead global temperature? Why or why not?
I guess it's like a globalizing effect of some changes that are happening at a local level. So if, increases in certain temperature in certain areas are causing an increase in CO2, then the increase in CO2 will make that increase in temperature global. So, one part of the climate system is leading CO2, while the other part of the system, the global system, is lagging behind, kind of catching up from those localized effects.
Hey, Nora, do you want to try to take a stab at why Antarctica is important? Like why are we focused there?
Well, I noticed in the paper that the like trigger was actually in the northern hemisphere, which I didn't catch the first time around. So that's like starting the seesaw, which would, if I'm remembering correctly, bring more heat to the southern hemisphere. So looking at Antarctica would be an indicator of how that system is working. And then the CO2, which would be increased from changes in ocean circulation, would then come after that. And then after that would be the global temperature increases, sorry.
That's great.
Cool. Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
No, that's totally right on the mark. I guess, Sean, I'm not sure if this was also maybe where you're going with Antarctica, but I guess just to speak to that for a quick second. I mean, I don't know if you guys have covered the carbon cycle at all in class so far, how carbon moves around the system.
A bit, yeah.
A little bit, yeah. But I mean, and Nora, you were just mentioning the ocean circulation, and by far the single biggest place you can stuff carbon on the planet on these shorter timescales is in the deep ocean. So if you want to get CO2 levels to rise in the atmosphere, a great way to do it is to uncork the ocean and get a bunch of that carbon to come bubbling out of the water up into the atmosphere. And a super key spot, a really key valve on where that exchange can happen, happens to be around Antarctica. So it's often a place paleoclimatologists look really closely when they're thinking about the carbon cycle. It's a kind of a critical gateway in the carbon cycle.
Cool. Okay, this last one I think I'll ask you, Jeremy, actually, because this is sort of open-ended here. But yeah, I guess if you could talk about, I don't know, the role as a paleoclimatologist, being both climate historian and climate skeptic. I think that, I mean, you know, contrary to popular belief, one thing that people do really well in this field is roast each other about their findings and make it really difficult to publish anything, and are just totally super critical, which is important, right? Because we don't want to just take what we're given, right, and just not think about it, even if it agrees, you know, like, yes, I do think climate science is important and real, but it doesn't mean I should just blindly say every paper I read is going to be on point if it's talking about climate science. So maybe just talk about that and then how it relates to this disagreement that you found and effectively answered.
Yeah, I mean, always a skeptic, right? Scientist is just, you know, AKA a skeptic. You always want to take in information really critically. I mean, that's like constantly what we're doing. Andy, you spoke to it, but I mean, the wildest thing, I think, when I first got to grad school and went to conferences is to go see people give talks to a room of like 100 other scientists. And not to freak you into being a scientist, it doesn't always happen, but like the degree to which sometimes the crowd will just like maul the speaker, like hands go up and just like, wait, what the hell are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense, blah, blah, blah. There's not too much cursing, but I mean, it's not always that aggressive, but there's like, you know, finish a talk and it's like hand, question, wait, what about this? How did you do this? How do you know your statistics work? Maybe you want to be in a skeptical group, like scientists are just, they will just eat ideas alive, which is great because that's how you separate, you know, the solid stuff from what's flimsy and bogus. So yes, you always want to approach it from that perspective. And sometimes, like when I give talks on this stuff, or, you know, present it to like my students, they're like, hey, I don't mean to question it. I don't want to challenge it. And I'm always like, no, like jump all over it. You absolutely do want to question it. Like, let's see what's sturdy here in these ideas. We don't want to hold on to anything that's flimsy. So I guess, and then Andy, the second part you were getting at was kind of linking that to this bit here. Yeah, I guess, how does that link to this bit here? I mean, I think this turns out to be kind of like a nuanced, interesting little story, right? There's like, it's not as simple as people maybe want to like make this stuff out to be. I guess before we published this paper, a lot of times people would talk about ice ages, like, you know, you might get a lot of like the most climate alarmed people being like, CO2 drives ice ages. And then you might get really climate skeptic-y people being like, no, the CO2 comes later. Ice ages drive CO2, which both turn out to be like too simplistic, right? It's not that simple. It's sort of like an initial bit of climate change during an ice age triggers the carbon to start going. Then that carbon in turn feeds back and gets the climate to keep rolling forward. And it's sort of like, it's tricky, right? And the only way you're going to get to that is being really skeptical, looking up close, kind of getting all the data on the table and trying to parse through it.